Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Jason Harris, filmmaker, comedian, star of off Broadway.
Wow, that is a lot of offs. So we have recently kind of wrapped up our season on the films of 1996, but there are so many awesome movies in that year, and we got so many great suggestions from our listeners for movies that they wanted to hear us talk about that we decided to add on a couple of bonus episodes at the moment for our Patreon patrons. And the first one is going to cover a movie that several of our listeners mentioned that they wanted to hear about. And I think that all of us here at the Old Awesome Movie Year headquarters are fans of. And that is Christopher Guest's mockumentary, Waiting for Guffman. So that's what we're doing this time, Waiting for Guffman.
Yeah, Josh. And man, I'm so glad people kept recommending it and fighting for it and saying we should cover it. And as you know, this was a struggle for me to not pick as my personal pick. So I'm very happy that we're covering it. I do think it's not only a very good movie, very funny movie, but a very, very influential movie, as we've seen this style of mockumentary based on improv kind of take off on its own form in the last 20 years.
Yeah, this movie is hugely influential, and I'm sure we'll talk about a bunch of that later on. But I mean, at the time it came out, it was pretty well regarded. Also, it was certainly a small film made on a budget of $2.9 million and grossed $4 million at the box office. So that's not really a big hit. But I think, as we've talked about with a lot of movies in this season, this is one that went on to just build and build and build its following on home video to the point where it became kind of ubiquitous.
Yeah, this could have been our future cult classic, but you might be right. This might have gone beyond just a cult classic because it is pretty beloved. And as you rewatch it, imagine knowing nothing about this movie in 1996 and walking into the theater and seeing this story of this group of ragtag community theater players putting on a sesquicentennial celebratory play of a small town in Missouri. And then imagine just knowing nothing about it. Maybe you don't know anything about Christopher Guest past or any of these guys. Like, what a strange movie to walk into.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the people who initially went to see this movie were probably ones who did know about Christopher Guest, and especially who knew about This Is Spinal Tap, the previous mockumentary that he had been involved with as a star and as a writer.
But not director.
No, because of course the director of This Is Spinal Tap is our favorite director here at Awesome Movie Year, Rob Reiner.
That's right, the official director of Awesome Movie Year, Rob Reiner.
But I think probably people who, and of course Spinal Tap, another movie that built and built and built this really devoted following over the years. A lot of the people I think who went to see this movie initially are people who were familiar with Spinal Tap. And then it branched out beyond that to the point where I would almost, maybe not, but I think it's close as to whether this movie is maybe more well-known and more popular than This Is Spinal Tap is at this point.
I think you're right. Like, you could easily make that argument. I think so. I mean, dude, he's become so influential. I think you could say that about Best in Show maybe also.
Yeah. I think we could and will later. But this movie, to start off with,
stay tuned, everyone.
Please do. Don't turn us off yet. This movie premiered at the Boston Film Festival in 1996, and it also played the Toronto International Film Festival in 1996. Was released commercially actually in early 1997, so kind of built up a bit of word of mouth at the film festivals to start with. It was quite well reviewed by critics. It got 2 thumbs up from Siskel and Ebert. And Roger Ebert in his review said, "The movie doesn't bludgeon us with gags. It proceeds with a certain comic relentlessness from setup to payoff, and its deliberation is part of the fun, as when it takes its time explaining the exact nature of the travel agent's plastic surgery." That's the character played by Fred Willard. The comic tone of Waiting for Guffman has grown out of Second City and the classic SCTV TV show. Attention is paid not simply to funny characters and punchlines, but to small nudges at human nature. And I do think that's one of the important things about this movie is that it is funny, but it's not just mean-spirited and mocking its characters, that it does have an affection for them in their kind of pathetic nature.
Yeah, I don't think it mocks any character, to be honest with you. And that was one of the strengths of it because, Corky St. Clair, who has a wife that we never see, who's always shopping for her. It would have been so easy to just take the obvious gay joke route, especially in the mid 90s, but they all take everything Corky says and does at face value. And all the jokes that come from him are built out of that character and are pretty brilliant. That of all the characters in the guest universe might be my favorite one.
Yeah, it's a tough line to walk, and not everyone sees it as completely successful, but I think mostly it does work, and that even if it is mocking these characters at certain times, but I think even in the mockery, it has a level of affection that never becomes mean. Owen Gleiberman in Entertainment Weekly said, Christopher Guest has always been inspired. On Saturday Night Live, and most famously in This Is Spinal Tap, the delirious heavy metal satire driven by his performance as a wickedly self-deluded rock egotist. But in Waiting for Guffman, he transcends even his usual teasing highs. Waiting for Guffman is a madcap gem, a movie that salutes the garishness, the shameless enthusiasm of middle Americans whose lack of talent is matched only by their eagerness to parade it. Guest knows these people are ridiculous, but the beauty of the film is that they're never just ridiculous. When the musical finally goes up, it's a veritable triumph of tackiness. Ed Wood would have been proud. Yeah, I think, again, it's a fine line to make it believably bad, but also entertainingly bad and also with love. And I think the movie mostly does that.
Yeah, and Gleiberman, he points out Middle America, which there are definitely aspects of it that take they take their shots at. But I think any community theater group, any local band, we in this season where we talked about the Quadratics in Welcome to the Dollhouse, you can argue that these are the locals of anywhere that have dreams that maybe they didn't even know they had until the magic of Corky St. Clair.
Right. And of course, I mean, in Spinal Tap, they're making fun of people who are the opposite of this. They're very successful, big name rock stars, and they're just as ridiculous and just as deluded in their own ways. So it's not just small town America.
No, of course. And then we get A Mighty Wind where he does it to the folk movement also. So.
Right. And I think it's generally in all of his films, it's done with this level of affection. But again, it's not a surprise to me that some people might see it slightly differently. Ruth Stein in the San Francisco Chronicle said, Guffman is so matter-of-fact at the beginning, as the townspeople interviewed glow with pride about the festivities, that it takes a while before it dawns on you how hilarious this all is. They, of course, never get it. Later, she says, Christopher Guest doesn't let political correctness get in the way of outrageously caricaturing Jews and gays. The caricatures are so broad that it's hard to be offended by them. The portrayal of all small-town people as rubes is more troublesome because it's more subtle, at least as subtle as this film ever gets. So, I mean, her review is generally very positive, but there is a level of kind of wondering whether this works. And I think it's more about that, is that people are kind of unsure of whether this is okay. And they ultimately conclude, well, yeah, it's probably okay. But I can see how some people might not quite see it that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're living in the middle of cancel culture, and this, I don't know if there would be anything in this movie that someone would want to cancel, but I do think that, comedy, you have to take it to the edge, and a lot of the time you don't know you've gone over the edge until you've gone over the edge. But what Guest does so brilliantly is walk that line, right? He takes it right to the edge. And I just think it's all funny, man. I mean, we know flamboyantly gay people, and we know middle-aged Jews who are resembling of these characters. I know you said they're broad portrayals, but I feel like I could have known a Dr. Alan Pearl And I definitely have known a Corky St. Clair in my day, so.
Yeah, and I think they are broad, and that's not necessarily what I said. That's what this review says, but I think they are more nuanced than they could be. That it could be easy to tip it over into too broad. And I think part of that maybe is the process that they use to make these movies, where there's all this improv and there's so much material that Christopher Guest then whittles down into what is actually the movie. And it's very possible that some of the material that they didn't use goes too far in that direction, and that he knows how to pare it down into what works and what stays true to the character. So I do think the one aspect of Corky, the idea that he's flamboyant and gay isn't so much the problem, but the idea of the winking references to him being in the closet and his wife that he talks about, that's the kind of thing that maybe we wouldn't use today, and is a little dated, is I think maybe the most dated thing in this movie. The Alan Pearl character, the Jewish dentist, I think is less problematic, if we want to use that word. But overall, it didn't strike me as a problem with this movie. I do think the balance is handled pretty well.
Yeah, but Corky in the mid 90s moving to Blaine, Missouri, he might have had to, if we were going to dissect this as a real, person in a real town. Like, do you think a guy who with a Broadway showmanship and, everything as a very out gay person would feel comfortable in a town like Blaine? I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's fair. And so maybe in real life, someone in that position would remain closeted. Although I think the jokes about Corky are not that he's hiding from the townspeople and that he's doing it for the reason that you described, that he wouldn't be accepted. The joke is that he's hiding it from himself, is that he's closeted and that he is putting on this facade and really trying to sell it because he's trying to convince himself of it. And so the joke's more on him than it is on the town. And I think that's where you could point out being where to go back to what we've talked about before, the punching down versus punching up. If the joke is on the gay person who is dealing with being closeted versus the joke on people who wouldn't be accepting, that's where it's a little dicey. But again, I think ultimately it comes out being fine. And it's not mean-spirited, just like the rest of the movie isn't mean-spirited. And ultimately the movie has a lot of love for Corky.
Yeah, and I got it a little differently. At no point do I think that Corky is not aware that he is gay. I just think, maybe he's, as a performer, masquerading in front of other people without letting them in on the true nature of his sexuality.
Yeah, maybe it's not that he's not aware that he's gay, but he's trying to keep it a secret and again, he's sort of trying to keep it a secret from himself, or he's trying to will himself to be this heterosexual idea that he comes up with. But I mean, that's maybe more than we need to read into Corky St. Clair, but yeah. I do think that's there.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we're getting to Act 3 when Johnny Savage, the real macho mechanic, drops out of the play and Corky has to take over all of his parts, which are all very masculine, traditionally masculine parts, like that leads to so much humor and so many laughs that, like, I mean, that character, you would say, is completely miscast in that show, and it's hilarious. So, I don't find anything problematic with this film, and I don't want to, and I don't think anyone would want to, because it's so funny and, as you said, good-natured. Like, it's really, really funny. So
yeah, it is funny and it is good-natured, and I think the vast majority of people who watch it aren't finding problems with it, but some are, and I felt like that was reasonable to address, even in 1996. At least one reviewer there mentioning that in a review, as I said, that's overall very positive, and she's very much recommending the movie.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, Jason, too, that you mentioned, like, what would it be like walking into a theater in 1996, not knowing anything about this movie and just experiencing it for the first time? And that is, I think, the experience that I had. I remember going to this movie. I did see it in the theater in 1996. I went to the Gold Coast Twin, if you guys recall that theater that used to exist here in Las Vegas, that was our one place to see art house films at the time. And I'm sure I knew something. I mean, I must have known something about it in order to have made the effort to go see it. But I don't know if I had ever seen This Is Spinal Tap at that point. And this was sort of my first exposure to this kind of thing. And I loved it. I mean, I remember coming out of the theater thinking that it was great and thoroughly enjoying it and being eager to see more Christopher Guest movies afterwards. Although I hadn't seen it since then. This was the first time I'd watched it since seeing it in the theater in 1996. So did you see it in the theater, Jason?
I did see it in the theater. And, in a past episode, we talked about how usually on Friday afternoons in our high school, we didn't have class a lot of the time. So we were able to get out early. And I think it was like another one of these random groups of high schoolers that if I mentioned names to you, you'd be like, oh, I haven't heard that name in a while, right?
Right.
And I knew a little about it, but again, I really thought this was one of the funniest movies I had ever seen when I saw it. And I think I'm with you in that I went back and watched This Is Spinal Tap afterwards, but this was like revolutionary in the style of comedy to me. So Dave, what about you, your first time?
Actually, funny enough, I saw it at the Gold Coast as well while we were here on vacation. I still lived back in Pennsylvania, but we were here on vacation. I saw it with my parents there. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I remember distinctly, I don't think I've ever seen my parents laugh as hard as when Eugene Levy explains why he can't take his glasses off during the show. that really hit for my parents.
Yeah, as very Jewish people, how did they feel about?
Oh yeah, no, they love it. Love it.
Yeah, I had read one of the anecdotes of Fred Willard. There's that line where Eugene Levy has Blaine Fabin in the place as where he goes, "What do your perceptive and keen eyes tell you?" And then you see Eugene Levy without the glasses and that kind of cross-eyed moment, and Fred Willard didn't know he was doing the scene without the glasses or how his eyes would look until he said that line. And when he saw how Eugene Levy was, his facial expression as Willard delivered that line, he just had broke up for 10 minutes and had to call it a take there because it was so funny. So, and I think that's where you're talking to some of those more subtle setups that pay off as the camera catches it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at the time, I think I'm with you guys, is that I laughed like crazy at this movie. I thought it was hilarious. And coming back to it, I think in part because Christopher Guest has done so many similar things since then, I'm sure I didn't laugh as hard this time, but I still did. I still found it quite funny and enjoyable to watch again after all this time. So any other background on this film you want to mention, Jason?
Yeah, Josh, you mentioned that they shoot just an insane amount. It's like 60 hours of film and it takes a year to a year and a half to edit. And I think that is why they are in some ways so successful, because they go so deep on character and probably take after take are trying to top themselves, but without trying to top themselves. It's not like, hey, let's do a punchline, but let's see where the scene can go, So I know Guest, his whole thing is the liberation of not knowing, knowing that maybe he has to get from point A to point B, but not knowing how he's going to get there, which is a really fun way to do things. And the only other two things I wanted to mention, the musical sequence in the original cut, which who knows how long that was 40 minutes. And I think I'd watch 40 minutes of the Red, White, and Blaine musical personally. And then the last thing is this is Meryl Streep's favorite movie.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's the improv is not just about the jokes, as you were saying. It's also about the character development. Much like Mike Lee, who we discussed earlier this season.
Not about the jokes, yeah.
No, but about developing character via collaboration with the actors and via improvisation. So that's something they have in common.
And that is, one of the tenets of improv. You're not going for the joke. You're going to heighten and build the scene and, take it to a believable place where the comedy's coming from. So, yeah, that's where we're at with the first watch on Waiting for Guffman. And let's talk about our current thoughts when we come back, Josh.
Let's do that. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year in this special bonus episode of our season on the films of 1996. We're talking about Christopher Guest's mockumentary, Waiting for Guffman, which, as mentioned, was obviously a favorite of a number of our listeners who suggested that we talk about it, and a favorite, I think, of all of ours, or at least had been a favorite from back in the day. And Jason, how did you feel coming back to this? First of all, had you watched it multiple times in the intervening years.
I couldn't tell you the last time I watched it. I'm sure we all watched it. Well, you didn't, but we all,
No.
in college I watched it, and maybe, sometime thereafter. But I think this is one of those pieces that maybe I have such pristine memories of that I didn't want to rewatch. But I agree with you, Josh. I wanted to laugh more out loud, and I didn't laugh out loud. I'll tell you when I did laugh out loud is during the Covered Wagons number, when Corky St. Clair looks at the audience with those ravaged eyes of his and just goes, "Everybody dance," but the whole thing was so entertaining all the way through. It's just so much fun to watch.
It is fun. Yeah. And as I was saying, I definitely didn't laugh as much this time, but I certainly enjoyed it. And it's kind of a feel good movie in a way, I think. And that comes out of the way that the characters are treated, that it's funny and you can laugh at them, but you can also have this level of affection for them and you want to spend time with them because they're so lovable in their own ways. So I enjoyed it. I felt like it had a lot of really funny moments. It's a reminder of how funny all of these performers are. I mean, they would all go on, of course, to work with Christopher Guest over and over again. But I mean, Fred Willard, who sadly passed away recently, Catherine O'Hara, Eugene Levy, Parker Posey, who I think outside of these Christopher Guest movies is so underrated as like a comedic actor, but she's really funny in this movie. I mean, her number where she performs Teacher's Pet as the audition for Red, White, and Blaine is so uncomfortable, but hilarious to watch. She's great. Bob Balaban, who underplays everything in this movie, just his like
I love
contempt
him so
that he has for Corky St. Clair, the like seething rage underneath that character about how much he loathes Corky St. Clair, I think is really funny to watch. So, and even in the small parts, I forgot that David Cross was in this, who has not been in subsequent Christopher Guest movies, but he has a great little bit as the UFO investigator who talks about how the weather is always the same at the UFO site. It's always 67 degrees with a 40% chance of rain, which is a great, really funny line. Don Lake as the kind of clueless, all the town elders, Larry Miller as the mayor. And I especially loved in this movie, Michael Hitchcock as the city council person who is clearly in love with Corky.
Fan. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, more than a super fan. I'm pretty sure he is in love with Corky in a romantic, sexual way.
Yeah, he is. And one of the alternate endings has those two living in New York City together. Corky and Steve. But yeah, no, all of those, Larry Miller, I think, drives a number of good scenes there too. But Bob Balaban, I know, Dave, you were saying you loved him. I think he is so important in this movie to anchor it to a place of realism. Like, he's this high school musical teacher. And like I said, look, I'm in a play reading group every week, and there are big characters, like real life big characters in these type of things. So I think what you're getting there with, Ron and Sheila and Dr. Alan Pearl, these big characters, and Corky's the biggest of them all, you need someone to anchor it to show you the reality and the gravity of the situation. So I agree with everything you said. They're all so funny. Parker Posey is an underrated gem of a performer. Catherine O'Hara, and Fred Willard have their places, and Eugene Levy and Christopher Guest too on the mantles of comedy, so I agree. There's just, it's almost like, how could a movie go wrong with this much talent? And as we know, this one did not go wrong.
No, it did not. And I think we think of all these people as titans of comedy, but I wonder at the time this movie came out, if that was a period when maybe people like Catherine O'Hara and Fred Willard and Eugene Levy were lesser. I mean, they had done a ton of stuff and like SCTV that was mentioned in one of those reviews, but they weren't the top comedy stars of 1996.
No, this one kind of lit the fire again. Well, look, Catherine O'Hara, Beetlejuice, she's always like, you can always get she's so consistent. You can get a great performance from her in anything. And, she's a great supporting player in comedies. And now I think she's having what a renaissance with Schitt's Creek and Eugene Levy too, right? But I agree with you. This kind of like lit the fuse where a lot of these people, and a lot of these people who we didn't know at the time, but
I didn't either. I'm sure walking into this movie, I wasn't familiar with almost any of these actors.
Right. But I think this like relit like, oh, look at all these old, kind of improv players, whether it was SCTV or Fernwood Tonight or whatever, where it's like, and then they're just prevalent in the last 25 years of pop culture as great comedic players in so many different projects after this.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is that they were all working steadily, but they were more known as these kind of supporting people. In fact, walking into this movie, probably the one thing I knew was Catherine O'Hara as like the mom in Home Alone or something like that. Although I would have seen Beetlejuice as well.
Yeah,
but
which she's great in also, by the way.
Yeah, and she's great, but I think she was a supporting performer in these things. And same with Fred Willard and Eugene Levy. These weren't people who were cast as the leads in comedy movies. And this gave them the chance to do that, and gave them the chance to be those leads maybe in other projects, although maybe still primarily in Christopher Guest movies. But, now we think of when Fred Willard dies, he's known as this comedic great. And I think this movie was a big reason why he got back to that point.
Yeah, he's so natural, but he steals every scene that he's in, And it's not like, he's a big personality, but I don't think he's a space eater at all. It's just that personality is what he brings. And, I think probably people would say as the commentator in Best in Show, maybe that's the height of that. But he just steals every single scene that he's in a very natural way. I wanted to also say, and then Dave, I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Josh, we mentioned Spinal Tap. The songs are so good in this, in the community theater way. And, it was Guest and Michael McKean and Harry Shearer, and then William Ross, who I don't know much about, but that's who created this music that is still running around in my head after a few days of having seen it again.
Yeah, the songs are great, and they're exactly the right balance where they're great, but they're not too great that you can just believe that they were created for this terrible local community production. So yeah, Dave, as a musician, and as someone who's created believably period appropriate music, I guess we could say.
Hey, that's a great review from Josh Bell of what I've done. But yeah, no, I think it strikes that perfect balance though of like good enough, but not too good, and so funny. I love Christopher Guest songs. He's so funny.
Yeah, I mean he's great at writing, and it's hard to write a funny song. We talked about Weird Al in a previous season, and to write a funny song that's funny but is also a good song, that I think is a really difficult balance. And the stuff in this movie is great. Of course, in A Mighty Wind, it takes it to a whole new level with the way that they're able to do that. But it definitely comes across here where it's catchy, and like Jason was saying, it'll run around in your head after you heard it, but it'll also make you laugh in the moment that you're watching the movie.
And yeah, so when we see Dr. Alan Pearl as a Martian doing Nothing Ever Happens on Mars, right? Like Blaine, Missouri is where you want to go to get the excitement of the universe. And the cutaways to the audience and their delight, it adds so much, whether you're seeing his wife just be like, just realize what a talent she thinks he is, or Larry Miller as the mayor, and just he's so happy. And as you mentioned, Steve, the councilman, Blaine Fabin's, great or whatever granddaughter, they're just all so happy with this musical. They think it's such a smash. And yeah, it's so much fun, man. It's just so much fun. There is I looked it up on YouTube. There were two songs that were cut. One was Nothing Ever Happens in Blaine, which is what that's calling back. Nothing Ever Happens in Mars. And it's kind of funny that they applaud, because the reason they applaud story-wise is it's a callback to a song that they know. But the way, since that was cut, we just see them as applauding because they're delighted with Nothing Ever Happens in Mars. In this,
we do see rehearsals of Nothing Ever Happens in Blaine. The whole bit where Bob Balaban is telling them not to pronounce the last letter.
Yeah, you say Blaine.
Yeah,
yeah,
right. The other one's called The River Bulging, which is a very kind of epic piece of are we going to make it through this kind of flood season? And what I love about that is If I'm not mistaken, Corky's wearing his pants backwards again, which he does when he's doing the choreography. Which, by the way, if not the funniest dance moves I've ever seen, I'd have to say.
Those are great moves. And the one of the only dated things about this movie, referencing, I assume it was like a Criss Cross reference.
I think even at the time that was a dated reference because Criss Cross was 92, 93. But I could see Corky wearing his pants backwards today.
Right. Or Corky thinking that the like height of hip is to emulate Criss Cross. So I feel like that's a successful joke. So I do want to shout out, and I should have looked up the actor's name, but not someone who became a big part of the repertory players for Christopher Guest, but Alan Pearl's wife is very funny. And I love her enthusiasm too, as you were mentioning, because I think the sort of predictable or expected thing would be for her to be annoyed at her husband being away and always rehearsing for his little play, but she just gets super into it and is really supportive. And I did kind of wonder, we have the epilogue where Alan Pearl is now living in Miami and pursuing his dream of singing, and we don't see the wife with him. And I had to kind of wonder if she went with him to Miami or not.
I'm going to say she did because that's the type of movie this is, although things get a little dark in the epilogue. But I do love that in that epilogue, what Alan Pearl is singing is what his great grandfather sang on, back in the day. What was that circuit called?
In vaudeville.
Borscht Belt.
In the Borscht Belt. Yes.
Yeah, the vaudeville circuit, which is my booby made a kishka.
Yes. That is great, and that's a great callback again because he mentions it in an early interview, sort of towards the beginning of the film, and then he brings it back in later on. So that is quite a classic.
Yeah, and now you could see that as a vaudeville and a Borscht Belt hit of sorts. My booby made a kishka.
And of course, all those old retirees in Miami would be familiar with it and appreciate his performance.
Or not care at all.
Right. It was hard to tell exactly.
You got to go where the love is. And for him, the love was in Miami. So.
Right. Although, again, as you were saying, the love is in Blaine. And that is one of the nice things, too, about this movie is that we, as the audience of the movie, can see that these people are ridiculous, but it's not a movie about failure. It's a movie about putting on this play and putting all the hard work in it. And Guffman doesn't show up, but everyone in the town of Blaine loves the play. They go crazy for it. They have a great time and they are super into everything. And so I kind of like that's the nice thing that, hey, they actually did a really nice thing for the town.
Right. Guffman doesn't trash it because he doesn't see it. Right. But,
right.
What's funny. And when Corky leaves, cause they won't give him any money, I'm going to go home and just bite my pillow because you're all bastard people, The way they come back or try to get Corky back by impressing upon him that it's going to be a disaster without him, that Blaine needs the magic of Corky St. Clair, and that, the relative of Blaine, Fabian, the town founder, just says, the person who really needs you right now is Blaine Fabian, and she's on the verge of tears. I mean, what a way to bring someone back. How could you turn down the opportunity to go and make Red, White, and Blaine after that?
Yeah, the townspeople, everyone in this movie, they love Blaine so much, and that's why they love this play because it celebrates their hometown, their stupid, lame hometown that they just think is the best thing ever, and it's just nice. It makes you almost think that Blaine, Missouri would be a nice place to live. Almost, not quite, but close.
I feel like Blaine, Missouri today would be, in my mind, these people might not, but if Blaine, Missouri was a real place, I would just be reading about it and being like, ugh, they're banning masks. You're not allowed to go into a business if you're wearing a mask right now,
Yeah. It's nice that we can see the pleasant side of a place like that we would maybe not see it if someone made a movie like this today. So I wanted to also shout out to Corky's apartment where he lives. And I don't know where they shot. I mean, I know this was shot in Austin, Texas, but what that building is, but the fact that he lives in this this room that you have to take these ridiculously
Yeah.
large, long stairs, and there don't appear to be any lower floors in the building. It's just these outside stairs that go way up to the top of the building where the door to Corky's apartment is. And again, I don't know what that is in reality, and maybe it's just the backside of some normal looking building, but I just thought that was hilarious. And why does Corky live there? And it's never mentioned, and I thought it was great.
It's the perfect place to take a bubble bath and listen to some Spanish music, you know, when you need to chill out. Yeah, it's like a warehouse space that's just like someone must have just said, you know, maybe that's the old stool factory because that was the stool capital of the world. And like, well, we have a top floor. You can just have it or something, you know.
Right. Yeah. It's just and it's, you know, no one ever like refers to it or talks about it or anything. It's just a background detail. That and his Judy Tenuta t-shirt.
Right. Yeah, the goddess of love. That's
Shout
what I
out
mean.
to Judy Tenuta.
There's so much good stuff like that, you know, that you're watching, and it's just so hilarious, you know. They mention one of the reviewer, Ebert mentioned the discussion of Ron's penile reduction surgery, which they play off as serious, you know, as like a real conversation, you know. I have what most guys would dream of, but and then Alan Pearl, he calls back his bit there when he's doing the old Johnny Carson thing, and he goes, "Ooh, medicine man, not one to get close to, dances with Stumpy," you know, and that's how he handles the awkwardness. It's so funny. Everyone's so funny. I love Parker Posey talking about her dreams of making a new Blizzard at the end of it, like
low fat.
Yeah.
And her standing at her barbecuing this one tiny little chicken wing is another great small detail.
Yeah.
But what you're saying, that scene with Fred Willard in the Chinese restaurant where he talks about his surgery, there's a lot of like anger and pain in the relationship between Ron and Sheila that comes out in a couple of scenes. And I think that goes to what you're talking about developing those characters via improv, that there's like a serious undercurrent there it's the fuel for humor, and it's not brought to the forefront necessarily, but it's clearly something that they worked on as actors and that they're using as background to play those characters. So I like that.
Well, yeah, it's just like as they're backstage in during the show, and you know, he says, you know, just finish my makeup and my hair, and you can go on and work on yourself. That pretty much sums up the relationship right there, right?
Yeah, and as someone I think maybe on Letterboxd point out, what another great thing that's subtle about that scene is that he makes her fuss over his hair for so long to get it exactly perfect, and then you see him go out on stage and he's wearing a hat.
That's good. I like the scene where, you know, they're talking about their process, and not just in the plays, but at scene study at home. He always has such extensive notes for me. Well, really, they're for both of us. Yeah, but most of them are for me, you know?
Yeah, it's perhaps an abusive relationship emotionally between Ron and Sheila, but yeah, that's very good. And I watched this movie on DVD, and there's a bunch of deleted scenes and that I started watching. And it's interesting, first of all, watching those scenes, you can see how much work went into paring this down, because I watched like 3 of them out of 15 or something and then turned it off because it's a lot of kind of shapeless looking for jokes. But there is one scene between Ron and Sheila where they're at home and he's forcing her to recreate his glory days as a high school baseball player that really also illustrates the kind of abusive emotional nature of that relationship.
Well, yeah, you're talking about some scene work. How about the auditions? You know, the old man who just says, "I'm going to do a scene from Raging Bull," you know, and the guy who just swallows the ping pong ball. And then we get the auditions of the main players, and seeing the reaction of Corky. He's good, you know, and then Bob Balaban, who never, you know, thinks anyone is good, apparently, by the way, you know, he's watching. Really just funny stuff all the way through. So
yeah, I mean, we could just go through and name all the jokes, but I think we've kind of covered it. So do we want to give this a rating out of 5 Remains of the Day lunchboxes?
Yes, yeah, that's a good reference. Well, you're gonna have to watch the movie to get it if you don't know it. It's 4 for me. It used to be 5. I'd say 4, which means it holds up really well. So 4 Remains of the Day lunchboxes for me.
Yeah, I probably would have given it 4 at the time, and maybe I'm going to give it 3.5 now, which is a good rating for me, and I do think it holds up and it's funny, but it more reminded me of kind of enjoying other ones a little more. So, Dave, did you watch this again? Dave, right? Did you watch this for it?
Yeah. I did. Yeah, I rewatched it. I loved it. 4 for me as well.
Yeah,
it's great.
It's a funny movie, and if obviously a lot of our listeners had seen it, but if you haven't, definitely worth watching. So we'll come back in a second and talk about the legacy of Waiting for Guffman. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year in this special bonus episode of our season on the films of 1996. We've been talking about a favorite, both of ours and of our listeners, Christopher Guest's Waiting for Guffman. And the main legacy of this movie, of course, is the whole career and body of work that opened up both for Christopher Guest as a writer-director and for nearly every actor who was in this movie, who went on to appear in later Christopher Guest movies and one TV series that were all constructed in this same manner and mostly also presented as mockumentaries. Best in Show, which I think is probably the best one, which is the next movie he made after this about professional dog shows. And then A Mighty Wind, his film about the folk music scene. For Your Consideration, which is not a mockumentary and I think is probably the weakest of these. That's about actors angling for an Oscar. And most recently, Mascots, which was a Netflix film about the subculture of sports mascots. And in between there, he had I think, kind of underrated TV series called Family Tree, starring Christopher O'Dowd as a guy researching his family history. That was fun. That was on HBO and is still available, I'm sure.
Was that a comedy, straightforward comedy though, Family Tree? Because I didn't watch the whole series. I should get back to it, but it felt not as comedic as the other vehicles.
Yeah, maybe it was a little less jokey, but it was definitely constructed in the same way. And I think, A Mighty Wind too. It's been a while since I saw it, but A Mighty Wind has a lot of like serious emotional content, especially in the relationship between the Catherine O'Hara and Eugene Levy characters in that movie. So I think, as always, as we were pointing out with this movie, like Christopher Guest and his actors are interested in getting to the like emotional center of these characters as a way to fuel the humor. And so maybe in Family Tree, it's been a while. I watched it when it first aired, but I haven't seen it since then. So maybe that had a little more seriousness to it, but it definitely had a lot of jokes and a lot of ridiculous characters. And this setup where Chris O'Dowd's character can kind of travel to meet different distant relatives in each episode, and they're all ridiculous in their own way.
I loved Family Tree. I thought it was such a shame when they canceled it. It really needed another season.
I don't think there's anything he's got in development right now, but anything Christopher Guest does, I'll watch. I want to go back and watch his first movie, The Big Picture with Kevin Bacon. I never saw that film.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. Or the movie actually in between this and Best in Show, the next movie he directed was Almost Heroes, starring Chris Farley and Matthew Perry as the explorers who followed Lewis and Clark, which I think was Chris Farley's final movie. And I have never seen that.
Yeah, I'd watch both of those. Obviously, this form has just exploded. We see so many movies emulate this form, and Curb Your Enthusiasm obviously is... I'm not saying a direct does it in the same way, but there is this kind of like, here's the outline, here's where we need to get, now let's get there. And in a much less successful fashion, Josh, I like to work in this form as well.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two sort of formats. You're talking there about the improv, the idea of letting the actors find the humor in the scene as long as it gets from point A to point B. But there's also the mockumentary, which of course he didn't invent, but I feel like that format, really took off after this. We talk about The Office and Parks and Recreation and those TV series. It's like a pretty standard format in a way for a TV series or for a comedy at this point. And Spinal Tap existed before this, and I'm sure other examples as well. But this was a movie that came out that really made that like a central format for people to use in comedy.
Yeah, Modern Family, does a lot of that too. There was a very good movie. I don't know, we'd have to rewatch it, but wasn't Drop Dead Gorgeous about like this too?
I think so. I haven't seen that, but that has a big cult following, definitely.
Yeah. The use of improv to get to a place and we said it with Mike Lee in a more dramatic fashion, but no one does it better than Christopher Guest comedically. Larry David at the same level, I'd say. That's really fun for me to watch.
Yeah, of course, the Jason Harris film Wrestling with the Past, or no, not that one. What was the one we made in high school? Was a mockumentary that was also about wrestling.
Yeah, there was a pro wrestling team in high school, and we used a lot of that stuff. But I mean, like I said, like I go about it a little differently. We script a lot of stuff and then build off of that via improv. But I would say, not that anyone cares, but the way I like to work is highly influenced by this style.
Of course, performers, as we were talking about, this really brought people like Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara and Fred Willard back into prominence as comedy players that had been around for decades. And Fred Willard, recently having passed away, had left behind such a massive, beloved body of work. Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara just finished up their run on Schitt's Creek, which eventually generated a very large following and lots of critical acclaim. Of course, Eugene Levy's son, Dan Levy, is the co-creator of that and star of that and carrying on the whole family legacy. A handful of performers who are not in this movie, but I was wondering, who is missing from this that you think of as
Jennifer Coolidge.
Yeah, Jennifer Coolidge, Jane Lynch, and Ed Begley Jr. were the ones that really stood out to me, who were in a lot of the later Christopher Guest projects. Ed Begley Jr. had a big role, I think, on Family Tree and was pretty entertaining on that as well.
Yeah.
And Parker Posey doesn't get her due, I think, as a comedy actor.
We love Parker Posey, the 90s it girl for indie movies. And I wonder, man, she should be working all the time still.
She should. I mean, and I think she is working pretty steadily, but she doesn't get these kinds of, she's not known for being like a funny performer. She's not known in the way that Catherine O'Hara is known, or like Melissa McCarthy or somebody. And I feel like she could be just as good, at least in the way that she demonstrates that in these Christopher Guest projects.
I agree. I mean, she's just so talented. She can do pretty much anything.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on the legacy of this movie?
Support your local community theaters when they come back.
Yeah, I'm sure Christopher Guest would agree that this is, as much as it's making fun of it, it's showing that this is an important institution. Like in the town of Blaine, this is what brings people happiness, is to get to go see the local community theater.
Yeah, and we're based in Vegas, so we have a ton of talent in our local theaters.
We do. And hopefully all of those people will get to perform once again. Maybe they'll be able to put on Red, White, and Blaine as a stage performance. You know what? That is one thing that I'm surprised has never happened. Like Spinal Tap as a band toured and made more albums after the movie came out. And I think even A Mighty Wind, they did some performances of those folk acts in a live setting. But as far as I know, Red, White, and Blaine has never been staged.
Man, that's a brilliant idea.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe a benefit someday when this when it's possible to do some live theater again. So, Dave, did you have any thoughts on this, music-wise, or anything else on the legacy of this film?
My only other thought was just that, I mean, I'm sure somebody has said this before me, but like with the rise of popularity of Zoom, it seems like the perfect place for these people to get together and do something funny right now.
Yeah, there have been so many reunions of casts of various movies. I think that would be great. And even in talking about the mockumentary format, we had the Parks and Recreation reunion episode done that way over Zoom. So, hey, if they want to do it, Christopher Guest is he clearly doesn't need to work. He's got his hereditary title there in England. He was a member of the House of Lords for a while, and he can do whatever he wants. But I would love to see that. I think that would be very funny.
One thing to think about is because we talk about like they treat the characters with love, and everything. Are any of them better off after the show?
No, I mean, they all are sort of pursuing their dreams there in the epilogue, but in a very misguided way. I mean, you can't see any of them succeeding at what they're doing there. So I suppose you could argue that the show has given them a false sense of their own abilities that they've gone on to pursue. Parker Posey's character, maybe because she decided not to, and she got stuck back at the Dairy Queen. I feel like
she didn't decide not to. She was gonna go to like New York.
She was going to, and she decided to stay. Her dad got out of
prison.
Yeah. So she decided she picked family over her dreams and went back to work at the Dairy Queen. And I feel like she could rise to like assistant manager of the Dairy Queen. Maybe she's got that within her reach.
Maybe in Corky's Hollywood memorabilia store in the middle of Times Square. I wonder what the rent would be on that right now. That would be out of business.
That's not surviving the pandemic shutdown.
I don't think that would have been surviving before that with the way the rents were going. So
probably.
So
yeah. So that's Waiting for Guffman, and that is the special episode of Awesome Movie Year. You can follow us on social media, which I'm sure you're doing if you found this episode.
I hope so. I'm Jason Harris Comedy on Facebook and Instagram. J Harris Comedy on Twitter. Go for jason.com. About as good a website as Red, White, and Plain is as a play. And then you got awesomemovieyear.com. Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram. Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter.
I am at joshbellhateseverything.com, at Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook, and at Signal Bleed on Twitter. And again, if you found us here, you probably are familiar with our producer David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
You can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts, including this great podcast. And if you are listening to this on the Patreon, thank you so much for being a patron. And we've got lots of other great content coming soon.
And speaking of which, we have another bonus episode for our 1996 season. Jason, do you want to tell us what that is?
Yes, Josh. As we had mentioned on the epilogue, we can't get through 1996 without Space Jam, which in the year of 2020 has surged in popularity recently.
So check out that episode as well for my complete confusion at the popularity of Space Jam. And thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.